Saint Anthony Maria Zaccaria was born in the city of Cremona in Lombardy, Italy in 1502. He came from a noble family but not wealthy family. His father, Lazzaro Zaccaria, died when Anthony was only 2 years old, leaving his education in the hands of his devout mother, Antonia Pescaroli. She instilled in him a deep sense of Christian piety and charity. Anthony studied the liberal arts and philosophy in Pavia before moving to the University of Padua to pursue medicine. He earned his degree as a doctor of medicine in 1524 at the age of 22. During his time in Padua, he developed a strong interior spiritual life, influenced by the Renaissance ideal of humanism and Christian reform. Returning to Cremona, he practiced medicine briefly, but soon shifted towards priestly studies, desiring to heal souls rather than bodies. In 1528, Anthony was ordained a priest. His early ministry was marked by energetic preaching, the promotion of the Eucharist devotion, and outreach to youth and marginalized populations. His zeal for reform led to his association with like-minded individuals who wished to revitalize the moral and spiritual life of both clergy and laity, heavily influenced by the teachings of St. Paul the Apostle. In 1530, in Milan, Anthony founded the Clerics Regular of St. Paul, later commonly known as the Barnabites, after their establishment at the Church of St. Barnabas. The group was composed of priests who committed themselves to preaching, missionary work, and the spiritual renewal of both the church and civil society. Their apostolate expanded beyond the pulpit, involving work with the sick, support of the ecclesiastical reforms, and engagement with young people and families. The movement was supported by key figures, including the Countess Ludovica Teorelli of Guastalla, who became an important patron and benefactor. With her assistance, Anthony also helped form two affiliate branches: the Angelic Sisters of St. Paul, a female religious congregation focused on charitable and education missions, and a lay confraternity known as the Laity of St. Paul, involving men and women in spiritual renewal and service. St. Anthony introduced the practice of public expositions of the Blessed Sacrament for adoration and actively promoted frequent communion at a time when such practices were rare. He is also credited with revitalizing the 40 hours devotion, a continuous period of Eucharist adoration spread over 3 days. His method of preaching emphasized interior conversion, scripture, penance, and the example of St. Paul, whom he considered the model of apostolic zeal. Anthony encouraged the laity to engage with scripture and live lives of active charity, anticipating later trends in the Counter-Reformation. His vigorous efforts in reform and evangelization were met with suspicion and resistance in some clerical and noble circles. In 1534, he was temporarily accused before the Inquisition in Milan of introducing heretical ideas. However, after investigation, he was fully exonerated and his work continued with official approval. This incident, though brief, underscores the tensions reforms faced in the church, still grappling with widespread corruption and the threat of Protestantism. In the summer of 1539, while on a mission in Guastalla, Anthony contracted a fever. Despite his deteriorating health, he traveled back to his birthplace, Cremona. There on July 5th, 1539, at the age of only 36, he passed away in his home of his mother. He was buried in the Church of St. Paul in Milan, associated with the order that he founded. His spiritual influence persisted well beyond his lifetime. The Barnabites, Angelic Sisters, and the Lady of St. Paul expanded throughout Italy and eventually across Europe. Anthony's writings, though few, were preserved and included in sermons, letters, and spiritual reflections focused on holiness, pastoral zeal, and the imitation of Christ and St. Paul. His sanctity was widely recognized in 1890, and Pope Leo XIII beatified him. He was canonized on May 27, 1897 by the same Pope. His feast day is celebrated every year on July 5th. St. Paul Zaccaria is considered a pioneer of the Catholic Reformation in northern Italy and a forerunner to the Counter-Reformation. His establishment of active congregations combining rigorous piety with social engagement helped revitalize Catholic life during a time of deep crisis. His veneration remains particularly strong in Italy, with his legacy carried on by global missions of the Barnabite order. The iconography of Saint Anthony Zaccaria encompasses symbols, visual motifs, significant artworks, and artistic traditions associated with him. Saint Anthony Zaccaria's iconography reflects his identity as a Reformed priest, founder, and mystic devoted to the Eucharist, St. Paul, and the renewal of the Church. His visual representations are often tied to his spiritual missions and historical contributions. Here are some of the primary attributes and symbols associated with his iconography. First and foremost is the clerical habit of the Barnabites. Saint Anthony is almost always depicted wearing the black cassock and white collar of the clerics regular of St. Paul or Barnabites, symbolizing humility, ecclesial reform, and active priestly life. The crucifix, frequently shown holding or pointed to a crucifix, signifying his deep devotion to the Passion of the Christ and his emphasis on preaching penance and moral renewal. In some representations, there's also elements of the Eucharist, such as the chalice with a host, is included, underscoring his promotion of the Eucharist adoration, particularly the practice of 40 hours devotion. Another common symbol shown in his iconography is images of St. Paul the Apostle. Anthony is occasionally shown alongside with an image or statue of St. Paul, reflecting his inspiration from Pauline zeal and his order's dedication to the apostle. There's also many angelic motifs that are seen in his iconography. Anthony is sometimes flanked by angels or depicted receiving a mystical vision involving angels, referring to the Angelic Sisters of St. Paul, the congregation he co-founded and his interior mystical experiences. He's often shown as well with books and scrolls. The books are often labeled with scriptural verses or theological texts, often referencing St. Paul's epistles, symbolizing his intellectual and grounded missionary teaching. Finally, the heart or flame is often shown in the iconography. A flaming heart or radiant light near his chest symbolizes the burning love of Christ and the spiritual fervor that characterized St. Anthony's mission. The iconographic setting and compositional styles often have the following three elements. First and foremost, a preaching scenes. Some works often show him mid-sermon addressing laity or religious, typically with urban or church settings, highlighting his gift for persuasive and reformative preaching. Second is the Eucharist processions or adoration. A number of paintings or frescoes place him in scenes of public Eucharist devotion, with monstrances and adoring faithful around him, referencing his role in reviving the Eucharist procession in Milan. Finally, there's the founding of various religious orders. St. Anthony is often shown surrounded by early members of the Barnabites or angelic sisters, usually in devotional or instructional contexts, portraying his leadership and spiritual fatherhood. Some of the notable artistic representations include St. Anthony Zaccaria by Francesco Caro from the 17th century. This is located in the Church of St. Barnabas in Milan. This Baroque portrait shows Anthony holding a crucifix, eyes lifted heavenward, evoking his intense spiritual ardor and mystical character. There's also the altarpiece by Carlo Francesco Nuvolin in 1650. This is found in the Barnabite Church of St. Paul in Milan. This composition includes Anthony in priestly garb with divine light illuminating his figure and reinforcing themes of sanctity as well as divine inspiration. There's also the Vision of St. Anthony Zaccaria by Giovanni Battista Tiepolo from the 18th century. This is a ceiling fresco formerly in the Barnabite Chapel, featured St. Anthony experiencing a heavenly vision with celestial light and angels, integrating dynamic Baroque motions and divine revelations. Finally, there's a modern mosaic in the Basilica of St. Paul in Milan. This was installed in the 20th century and is a vibrant piece that includes Anthony amid Barnabite saints and early Christian martyrs, linking his reformist spirit to the apostolic church. Of course, there are many geographical variations to the iconography. In Italy, particularly Milan, Cremona, and Bologna, depictions emphasize his role as a reformer and founder, while as in Central Europe, images focus more on the Eucharist and mystical elements. While as in Latin America, where Barnabites expanded in later centuries, devotional images adapted his figure to local styles, often depicting him as an intercessor for miracles or protection. There are many iconography elements that are included in devotional imagery and popular art. Printed on holy cards, votive paintings, and frescoes in Barnabite institutions frequently include inscriptions such as Apostolus Crucis et Eucharisti, or the Apostle of the Cross and Eucharist, reflecting his spiritual mission. Popular 19th century representations often show him surrounded by children or youth, symbolizing moral education and the impact on young souls. There are, of course, some unique elements in lesser known works. A mid 17th century Flemish altarpiece includes Anthony meditating on the crown of thorns, an unusual detail linking him to the Passion mysticism. And in a rare Spanish Baroque canvas, he is seen calming a crowd during a plague, connecting him to healing and social intervention. In conclusion, the iconography of St. Anthony Zaccaria is marked by profound theological symbolism, consistent visual motives tied to his religious initiatives, and a wide array of artistic interpretations. From Baroque paintings to modern mosaics, from intimate devotional prints to grand church frescoes, each depiction encapsulates aspects of his intense spiritual life, apostolic fervor, and foundational legacy. The miracles performed by St. Anthony Zaccaria were many. Here's a brief summary of some of those healings. The healing of a dying child in Milan in 1533. While St. Anthony Zaccaria was ministering in Milan, a noblewoman from the city brought her critically ill son to him. The child was near death from a sudden fever that physicians had declared incurable. Anthony, deeply moved, blessed the boy, prayed fervently, and placed his hand on the child's forehead while invoking the name of Christ. Within hours, the boy's fever broke and he recovered fully, astonishing the doctors and reaffirming public trust in St. Anthony's sanctity. Another miracle was the multiplication of bread for the poor in the early 1530s. During a severe winter in Milan, food became more scarce in a neighborhood where the Barnabites were distributing aid. St. Anthony, leading efforts to care for the needy, prayed over the remaining loaves of bread. Witnesses, including lay brothers and townspeople, attested to the bread seemingly multiplying and fed more than twice the expected number of hungry families. This event boasted local participation in charitable works and solidified the reputation of the Barnabite house. The apparition to the angelic sisters after his passing on July 6, 1539, is another miracle. The day after his passing, multiple angelic sisters of St. Paul in Milan reported a vision of St. Anthony appearing in a radiant white garment, smiling and extending his hand in blessing. One sister, Sister Lucia Terragni, later testified that his presence filled the room with the scent of lilies. This event was interpreted as a sign of his intercession from heaven and inspired increased vocations to the order. Another example of his miracles is a healing of a blind woman in Cremona in 1538. In the final year of his life, Anthony visited Cremona and was approached by a woman named Caterina Scalabrini, who had gone blind from cataracts. After confessing her sins and receiving the Eucharist from him, she asked for healing. Anthony placed his hands on her eyes and prayed silently. Her vision returned suddenly and completely. The case was documented by the local clergy and later presented during his canonization process. There was also the restoration of speech of an impaired boy in 1537. In Pavia, a 7-year-old boy who had never spoken before was brought to Anthony by his parents. After instructing them in faith and having them make a vow of repentance and almsgiving, Anthony prayed over the child during Mass. As the host was elevated, the boy suddenly spoke the word Jesus and then addressed his mother. The event was witnessed by the entire congregation and was noted in ecclesiastical records. Finally, there was also the deliverance from a plague for the city of Milan in 1531. In 1531, Milan was struck with a wave of illness, believed to be a resurgence of the plague. Anthony led public processions of prayer and Eucharist exposition, especially in the newly reintroduced 40 hours devotion. The death toll began to fall rapidly after the third procession. Local government officials acknowledged the sudden abandonment and attributed to the spiritual intervention led by Anthony and the Barnabites. In conclusion, the miracles attributed to Saint Anthony Zaccaria include both physical healings and spiritual interventions, occurring during his lifetime and also after his passing. They involved people of different social ranks, from nobles, to commoners, and took place in various Italian cities, particularly Milan, Cremona, Pavia, and Guastalla. These miraculous events played a significant role in the promotion of his cause for sainthood and reinforced his legacy as a holy reformer, healer, and intercessor. The canonization process for Saint Anthony Zaccaria is as follows. The initial veneration and reputation for sanctity from 1539 to the 1600s. Following St. Anthony Zaccharias' passing on July 5th, 1539 in Cremona, devotion to him began almost immediately within the Barnabite order and among the angelic sisters of St. Paul. His spiritual children, particularly in Milan, Guastalla, and Cremona, considered him a holy man and began to invoke his intercession for personal petitions. Though not yet formally recognized by the Church, spontaneous local venerations took shape through private prayers, testimonies of favors granted, and the preservation of his teachings and relics. The first steps towards formal recognition in the early 17th century. By the 1600s, leaders of the clerical regular of St. Paul, the Barnabites, compiled documentation of the saint's life, virtues, and reported miracles. These were intended to prepare the foundation for beatification cause during this time. Theological consultors and historians associated with the order began gathering eyewitness testimonies, spiritual writings, and accounts of supernatural favors attributed to his intercession. These early acts of documentation were crucial in preserving the memory of St. Anthony's sanctity and in providing material for future canonical investigation. The determination of incorruptibility and veneration of relics from 1545 to the 17th century. An exhumation of his remains in 1545, just 6 years after his passing, revealed that St. Anthony's body was incorrupt and emitted a pleasant fragrance, as well showing no signs of decay. This discovery was formally documented by church officials in Milan. The continued veneration of his relics over the next century led to widespread reports of miraculous healings and spiritual conversions, particularly in the Barnabite churches throughout Italy and eventually in parts of Europe and Latin America where the order had spread. In the later half of the 17th century, under pressure from members of the Barnabite order and the sympathetic bishops, the official process of beatification began and was formally introduced at the Congregation of Rites in Rome. This body, established by the Pope Sixtus V in 1588 to oversee the canonization of saints, began reviewing St. Anthony's life and the historical material already compiled. The Barnabites submitted documents attesting to his heroic virtues, including his dedication to the Eucharist, reform of the clergy, and founding of the religious communities. After centuries of devotion and documentation, Pope Leo XIII approved the beatification of St. Anthony Zaccaria on May 3, 1890. This declaration formally recognized that he lived a life of heroic virtue and could be venerated liturgically in certain regions by members of his religious family. His liturgical cultus was extended to the diocese where he had served and to the Barnabites and Angelic Sisters globally. The beatification ceremony held in Rome was accompanied by theological homilies and publications that described him as a precursor to the Catholic Reformation. The canonization process from 1890 to 1897. Following the beatification, the Congregation of Rites continued to examine miracles attributed to Anthony's intercession, focusing on those that occurred after 1890 and others that had long-standing and well-documented witnesses accounts. These included medical cures deemed inexplicable by contemporary science, and the process required verification by both medical experts and theologians. Reports were meticulously examined, and the Barnabites collaborated with canon lawyers and ecclesiastical authorities to expedite the final phase for the cause. Saint Anthony of Zaccaria was formally canonized by Pope Leo XIII on May 27, 1897, in St. Peter's Basilica in Vatican City. The declaration was made during a solemn papal mass attended by thousands, including Barnabite representatives from various countries, bishops, ambassadors, and the general public. The Pope praised Anthony's commitment to apostolic reform, Eucharist devotion, and his contribution to the renewal of the Church before the Council of Trent. In the Apostolic Brief, Pope Leo described Anthony as a mirror of pastoral zeal and apostolic charity, and emphasized his role in confronting spiritual decay during the early 16th century. The canonization decree allowed for universal veneration of the saint throughout Catholic Church, and his feast day was fixed on July 5th, the anniversary of his passing. After canonization, the Barnabite order promoted his cult across their missions in Latin America, Asia, and Africa. Churches and chapels were dedicated in his name, including one in Rome and another in Sao Paulo, Brazil. His relics were enshrined in a more prominent reliquary within the Church of St. Barnabas in Milan, which became a major pilgrimage site. Devotional literature, litanies, and biographies were published in multiple languages to extend his spiritual influence. In 1952, on the 450th anniversary of his birth, Pope Pius XII sent an apostolic letter praising his evangelical boldness in pre-Tridentine reform, further confirming the importance of his work to the history of the Church. In conclusion, the canonization process of St. Anthony Zaccaria was prolonged, complex, and deeply rooted in the historical growth of his religious family. It involved detailed examinations of virtues, miracles, and veneration, culminating in a universal sainthood under Pope Leo XIII in 1897. His recognition as a saint reinforced the legacy of the 16th century Catholic reformers and established him as a timeless example of Eucharist devotion, pastoral zeal, and spiritual leadership.